The morning Charles Voss broke their engagement, he did it standing up, with his hat still in his hands, as though he intended to be gone again within the minute, as though sitting down might make the thing he was about to do feel permanent. "I cannot marry you," he said. "I am sorry. There is nothing more I can tell you." Margaret Hale had been arranging dried lavender into a bowl when he arrived unannounced, the last of the summer's cutting, kept too long and gone brittle at the edges, and she set the final stem down with hands that did not yet understand what her ears had heard. 9 months of letters, of dancing, of the particular way he'd started looking at her across crowded rooms as though she were the only solvable equation in them, and now he stood in her father's drawing room delivering her ruin in 11 words and refusing to explain a single one of them. Charles. She had never called him by his Christian name in front of a servant before, and she did not care now. "You owe me a reason." "I owe you my absence," he said, "and I intend to give it to you." He bowed, the correct, devastating bow of a man already gone, and left before she could rise from her chair, the door closing on a future she had spent 9 months learning to believe in. The lavender sat scattered across the table where she dropped it, filling the room with a sweetness that for the rest of that year she would never quite be able to bear. By that evening, London knew the Duke of Cairo had ended his engagement to Miss Margaret Hale without explanation, and by the following week, London had supplied its own explanations freely. She had been indiscreet with a cousin. She had been caught reading correspondence she shouldn't have. Her father's fortune was not what it appeared. None of it was true, and all of it followed her into every drawing room she dared enter, until she stopped entering them at all and took instead to walking the kitchen garden at dawn, when no one fashionable was awake to watch her grieve. It was there, 3 weeks later, that an 11-year-old girl in a riding habit 2 sizes too large climbed over the garden wall and announced herself with the breathless certainty of someone who had been rehearsing this exact sentence for days. "You have to tell me what you did," Imogen Voss said. "Because Charles won't, and I am tired of everyone in this house pretending nothing happened." Margaret straightened slowly, lavender clippings still in her hand, the same sense she had not been able to escape since that morning. Imogen had been the unexpected gift of the engagement, a sharp, funny child who had attached herself to Margaret within a fortnight of their first meeting, who had been taught to braid her own hair properly on rainy afternoons and to sit a horse without gripping the reins like a drowning girl clutching rope, and who had spent every Tuesday since pretending not to care quite so much about either lesson as she plainly did. "I didn't do anything," Margaret said quietly. "Your brother simply changed his mind." "He didn't." Imogen's chin set in a line Margaret recognized, because it was Charles's exactly. "I know my brother. He doesn't change his mind. He decides things and then never speaks of them again, which everyone mistakes for confidence, but it is actually because he is a coward about explaining himself." She crossed her arms, a small, fierce general surveying a battlefield she'd only just discovered. "He has been locked in his study for 3 weeks reading the same letter over and over, burning candles at hours no sensible person burns candles, and when I asked him about it he told me it was a state business, which is what grown-ups say when they think children are stupid." Margaret's pulse caught. "What letter?" "I don't know. He keeps it in the drawer with the false bottom, the one he thinks I don't know about, though I have known about it since I was 7. Imogen's bravado faltered just slightly into something younger and more honest. "I don't want you to be gone, Maggie. I don't care what reason he has. I want you to come back." Margaret knelt in the wet grass and took the girl's hands, because there was nothing else in that moment she could offer her, and said the only true thing she had left. "I want that too. But it isn't mine to decide." What Margaret did not say, because she had not yet found the courage to say it to anyone, was that 10 days earlier, while helping her father sort through bank correspondence he could no longer always manage to read clearly himself, his eyes having dimmed badly over the past year in a way neither of them spoke of directly. She had found a statement that did not match the figures recorded in his own hand for the Cairo Benevolent Fund for War Widows, a trust established by Charles's late father, and entrusted, out of old friendship, to Sir Walter Hale's careful management for the better part of a decade. £11,000 her father believed still sat untouched in the fund's account did not, in fact, exist there. Margaret had said nothing of it, had not yet been able to make herself believe what the numbers were telling her, but she had begun, in the privacy of her own mind, to construct the explanation that made the most painful sense of Charles's silence. He had discovered it before she had. He knew, and rather than expose a frail, aging man's daughter to public ruin, he had simply walked away and let the world invent its own kinder lies about why. She had not fought him because she had believed, with the particular cruelty of grief mixed with guilt, that she had nothing left to fight for. In his study at Caro House, Charles Voss read the letter for what he guessed was the 100th time, though he had stopped counting somewhere around the 50th. It had arrived and signed 3 weeks before he broke the engagement, written in a careful, educated hand that gave away nothing of its author. Your Grace will wish to examine the accounts of the Benevolent Fund before proceeding further with the Hale match. Sir Walter has not managed his trust as faithfully as your late father believed. Ask him, if you doubt it, where £11,000 intended for the widows of Salamanca and Corunna have gone these 5 years past. He had not gone to Sir Walter. He had gone instead, quietly and without his name attached, to the fund's solicitors, and what he'd found there had not cleared the accusation so much as complicated it into something he didn't yet understand. The figures were indeed short, by nearly the sum the letter named. But the withdrawals did not match Sir Walter's hand precisely, and a clerk who had since left the solicitor's employ had countersigned several of the largest disbursements under circumstances no one currently at the firm could explain. It was not proof of guilt. It was also not proof of innocence, and Charles had a sister whose entire future depended on the unblemished name of Caro, since a dukedom passed only through sons, and Imogen had none of the protection a brother's marriage and an eventual nephew would one day provide her once Charles himself was gone. He had broken the engagement to buy himself time to investigate without dragging Margaret through an accusation that might, in the end, prove false and unforgivable to have made. He had told himself this was protection. He had not considered, until Imogen began watching him with open and wounded suspicion at every meal, that protection administered in total silence looked, to everyone receiving it, exactly like betrayal. It was his cousin Frederick who came to call that same week, ostensibly to offer sympathy, and who left Charles with the first real unease he'd felt about the whole affair. Wretched business, Frederick said, settling into the chair across from the desk with the easy familiarity of a man who had spent his whole life standing one misfortune away from everything Charles owned. As the son of Charles's late uncle, Frederick was heir presumptive to the dukedom, a fact both men understood without ever discussing aloud, since Charles had no son, and Imogen, however beloved, could never inherit the title that would one day need an heir of its own. I confess I cannot say I'm entirely surprised. Hale's finances were never as sound as they appeared. One hears things. He examined his gloves with studied disinterest. You were wise to extract yourself before the scandal broke properly. Better the engagement end quietly now than the marriage end in disgrace later. You seem remarkably well informed for a man who only just heard the news, Charles said. Frederick smiled, unbothered. I make it my business to know what concerns the family, cousin. Someone ought to, since you spend so little time at it yourself these days. He rose, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. I only meant to offer comfort. You've done the sensible thing. He left without waiting for a reply, and Charles sat for a long while afterward turning the conversation over with the particular discomfort of a man who has just realized someone knows considerably more than they ought to about a secret he believed was his alone. Frederick had heard about Sir Walter's finances before the news had broken anywhere Charles could trace, and Frederick, more than any other living soul, had reason to wish this marriage delayed indefinitely. Every year Charles remained unwed bought Frederick another year of safety in the succession. A scandal that ended the engagement entirely bought him considerably more. He went looking for the letter that night to examine the hand more closely, and found the drawer with the false bottom standing slightly open, the letter gone, and in its place a child's hair ribbon left behind. He understood immediately, not by accident. Imogen had taken it to Margaret before he had even finished cursing his own carelessness. She arrived at the Hale townhouse the following afternoon, having informed no one of her destination, walked the better part of 2 miles with a letter folded inside her glove, and was shown into Margaret's sitting room by a startled housemaid who had not been told to expect a duke's sister traveling unaccompanied and slightly out of breath. I found it, Imogen announced before any greeting, and produced the letter with the triumphant solemnity of a girl who understood she had likely done something forbidden and had decided it was worth it regardless. It's why he ended things. He thinks your father stole money from a fund for soldiers' widows. Margaret read it twice, the words arranging themselves into a shape that was both confirmation and contradiction of everything she had quietly feared for 10 days. This isn't signed. That's what I thought too, Imogen said. Charles never showed it to anyone, not even Frederick, except Frederick somehow already knew about it, because he told Charles the scandal was about to come out. I asked the solicitor man myself, when Charles wasn't looking, and he said no one outside the family had been told a word of it. She delivered this last revelation with the satisfaction of a junior detective laying out the final piece of evidence. Frederick knew before he should have known. I think Frederick wrote it. Margaret looked up sharply. Imogen, that is a very serious thing to say about your own cousin. It is a very serious thing he did, Imogen said with a child's unblinking logic. If he did it, and someone wrote this letter, and it wasn't you, and it wasn't my brother, and it certainly wasn't your poor father, so who else is left who wanted the wedding stopped badly enough to lie about war widows to do it? It was, Margaret had to admit, watching this furious loyal child standing in her sitting room with mud still on the hem of her habit. A far cleaner piece of reasoning than anything the adults involved had managed in 3 weeks of careful, miserable silence. They went to Charles together, because Imogen refused to be left behind and Margaret found she no longer had the strength to argue with her, and arrived at Carow House just as Charles himself was preparing to leave it, having spent the day pulling apart his cousin's recent debts with the particular thoroughness of a man whose suspicion had finally found a direction to run in. He stopped on the front steps at the sight of them, his sister's hand tucked defiantly in Margaret's, and for a moment none of the three of them spoke. I found the letter, Imogen said before either adult could retreat into politeness. I took it to Maggie because you wouldn't, and now you both have to talk to each other properly, because I am done watching everyone be miserable about something nobody will say out loud. It was, Charles thought later, exactly the kind of unanswerable ultimatum only an 11-year-old could deliver with a straight face, and exactly the intervention 3 weeks of his own careful silence had never managed to provide. They spoke that evening in the same study where Frederick had offered his false comfort. The letter laid flat between them on the desk, and what emerged over the following hour was not a single confession but 2 interlocking ones. Margaret told him of the bank statement she'd found, the figures that didn't balance, the guilt she'd been silently carrying that her father's failing eyesight had somehow become her family's disgrace and, by extension, her fiancé's burden to quietly escape. Charles told her of the anonymous letter, the solicitors, the clerk who had vanished from his post under circumstances no one had thought to question until now, and of Frederick's visit, the unease it had left behind like a stone in his boot he could not stop noticing. You let me believe you'd simply stopped loving me, Margaret said, and there was less anger in it than exhaustion, the particular flatness of a woman who has spent 3 weeks rehearsing a grief she now understood she had never needed to feel in the first place. I let myself believe I was protecting you, Charles said. I see now that it was only ever protecting myself from having to say a difficult thing badly. I'm sorry for it. I will spend considerably longer than 3 weeks proving that I am. It took 2 more days to unravel the rest, and it was, in the end, the dismissed clerk who broke it open, located by Charles's solicitor in a rented room near the docks, frightened and willing to talk the moment he understood Sir Walter Hale was not, in fact, the one asking the questions. Frederick Voss had approached him nearly 2 years earlier, when his own debts had grown past anything his allowance could cover, and had paid him to divert small sums from the fund's account, then larger ones the clerk's countersignature purchased cheaply and his silence purchased more expensively still. When Charles's engagement reached the point of becoming an actual marriage, and an heir behind it, Frederick had used the very theft he himself had committed to manufacture an accusation against Sir Walter, accomplishing 2 things with a single letter, covering his own fraud beneath another man's name, and ending, in one stroke, the union that threatened to push him permanently out of the succession. Sir Walter, when the truth was finally laid before him, wept with the particular relief of a man who had spent 10 days privately fearing that his own failing sight had betrayed him into a crime he couldn't recall committing, and Margaret held his hand and did not tell him how close she had come to believing it herself. What remained was not Frederick's guilt, which was now beyond question, but the damage already loose in London's drawing rooms, 3 weeks of whispered ruin that a clerk's quiet confession in a rented room would never reach far enough to undo. It was Imogen, again, who pointed this out over breakfast with the blunt clarity only she seemed willing to use. Everyone heard the lie out loud, she said, buttering her toast with great concentration. So someone has to say the truth out loud too, or it will only ever be a secret that a few people happen to know. Charles found, turning the problem over, that his sister was correct in a way no solicitor had thought to advise him. 3 nights later, Lady Pemberton's annual assembly drew the better part of fashionable London into a ballroom strung with candlelight, Frederick among them, still unaware that the floor beneath his comfortable scheme had already given way. Charles arrived with Margaret on his arm, a sight that alone silenced 3 separate conversations before he had crossed half the room, and led her not toward the dancing but toward the center of the gathering, where Lady Pemberton herself, sensing theater, made no move to stop him. Some of you have spent 3 weeks discussing why I ended my engagement to Miss Hale, Charles said, his voice pitched to Carrie without rising. I will spare you further invention. I broke it because an anonymous letter accused her father of stealing from the war widows my own father spent his life protecting. I believed enough of it to be cautious and not enough of it to be honest with the woman I loved, which was my failure, not hers. The truth, established this week beyond any reasonable doubt, is that Sir Walter Hale is innocent, that the funds were taken by another hand entirely, and that the man who wrote that letter is standing in this room. The silence that followed had a texture Margaret would remember for years, the particular held breath of 100 people realizing they were about to witness something they would describe for months afterward. Frederick's color drained by degrees, first from his face and then, it seemed, from the easy posture he had worn his whole life like a second coat. Charles, he began. You will have your chance to answer for it before the magistrate, Charles said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. Tonight I have said only what is owed to Miss Hale and to her father, who has been made to suffer for a theft he never committed. He turned from his cousin entirely and faced Margaret instead, and the ballroom, the candles, the watching crowd, seemed for a moment to recede from both of them. I am asking you, in front of everyone who heard the lie, whether you will still have me, now that you have heard the truth. Margaret thought of 3 weeks of lavender she could not bring herself to smell, of a child climbing a garden wall because the grown people around her had run out of courage, and found that the answer had been waiting in her for longer than she'd let herself admit. Yes, she said, and the room, after one more breathless second, broke into something that was not quite applause and not quite relief, but unmistakably both. Frederick left for the continent before the week was out, his creditors and the magistrate both considerably more interested in his whereabouts than his cousin troubled himself to be, and Carrow House did not trouble itself to wonder publicly where he had gone. It was Imogen who insisted, with the absolute authority of a girl who considered the entire affair principally her own achievement, that the wedding take place before the year was out, and it was Imogen who stood beside Margaret at the front of the small chapel 6 months later, in a new gown she had chosen herself, holding a small bound bundle of dried lavender that she had cut from the garden wall herself and declared, with great seriousness, far more fitting than any hothouse flower a lady's maid would have selected. You're really my sister now, she told Margaret afterward, gripping her hand through the crush of well-wishers with the same fierce, unembarrassed certainty she had carried over that same wall on the morning this had all begun. Charles says I'm not allowed to take credit for the whole thing, but I think I am allowed to take most of it. You may take all of it, Margaret said, laughing for what felt like the first time in a year that didn't have grief threaded somewhere beneath it. I shall tell everyone who asks that the Duchess of Carrow was found, not courted, climbed over a garden wall and refused to leave until someone told her the truth. Charles, watching the two of them from across the chapel garden, thought of 3 weeks of silence he could have spared them both, and of a child too young and too honest to understand why grown people so often mistook silence for kindness, and found he had no argument left to make in his own defense. He had been protecting the people he loved the only way he had ever been taught to, by carrying the weight alone and saying nothing until the danger had passed. It had taken his sister, 11 years old and utterly unwilling to accept a closed door as an answer, to teach him that the people worth protecting were also the people who deserved to be trusted with the truth. Years later, when Imogen herself stood at the edge of her own wedding, a sprig of lavender pinned, by then, into every bouquet the family carried as a matter of unquestioned tradition, she would tell the story to anyone who asked, the wall, the letter, the false bottom drawer, embellishing it a little more with each telling, Until in her favored version she had practically solved the entire conspiracy single-handedly while her brother sulked uselessly in his study. Margaret never corrected her. It was after all very nearly true. If this one pulled at you, there's more where it came from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and tell me in the comments whether Imogen was your favorite part too.